Happy Thursday and into lcpioneers.com live presented by PioStream as we are with you 4 days a week, Tuesday through Friday, 11:30 a.m. Pacific time, streaming on Facebook Live. You can bookmark lcpioneers.com/live to join us each Tuesday through Friday, as well as watch all of our past shows on demand at youtube.com/lcpios. We are keeping you connected with student athletes, coaches, and different members from throughout the Lewis and Clark College community, including our alumni base. Hi, everyone. I am Ryan Goff. I am the play-by-play voice and director of athletic communications for Lewis and Clark. We're the Pioneers out of Portland, Oregon, and a member of the NCAA Division III ranks, competing with over 430 institutions from throughout the nation as part of the 9-team Northwest Conference in Northwest Oregon and the state of Washington. This has been a really fun week, and we're only halfway through our Hall of Fame week as part of Lewis and Clark's Homecoming at Home celebration for the month of October, and we want you to get involved. You can let us know if you have a question for either of our guests today, who I'll tell you about in just a moment, or any of our future guests. You can also email us at any time, sports@lclark.edu. Put comments in the Facebook Live comments below. We are excited to celebrate lifetime achievement and meritorious service today. We have two guests, so we'll have two different segments of lcpioneers.com live today. Pablo Arizmendi in just a moment, a lifetime achievement inductee for the class of 2020. He is from the class of 1984 and a taekwondo national and world champion. So we'll talk to him momentarily. And then after a break, we'll bring in Judy McMullen, who spent a couple of decades as part of the Lewis and Clark Athletics Department. She was a coach. She was an administrator. She did so many great things for our Pioneers student athletes. So we'll talk to Judy later on in this edition of the show. So with that said, let's bring in our first guest. Pablo Arizmendi joins us on lcpioneers.com live. And Pablo, I appreciate you taking some time to join us and talk about your induction for lifetime achievement. And I mentioned that the thing that strikes me first is to try to get a basic understanding of the sport in which you excel, taekwondo, because that is not currently one of our 19 intercollegiate sports, right? It's something we don't talk about on this show. Give us a background on how you got started in the sport and what some of the big things people need to know about the sport.
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me, Ryan. It's exciting to reminisce for me and go back to my Lewis and Clark days. As you say, I was there in the period of 80 to 84, so a few years back. But to your question, I started in Taekwondo, and not really even Taekwondo, because back then when I started, I was 7 years old. So we're talking, the 60s, sometime in the 60s. And at the time, karate was the martial art that was more sort of popular. Taekwondo hadn't really made it in a significant way into the Western world, and certainly not in the United States. That evolved, and over time, and I think it was because there was more Korean immigration, which is where Taekwondo comes from, than any Japanese immigration, which is where karate comes from, into the Western world. And that was true for the US, Europe, and really throughout the world. So evolved into Taekwondo, started, as I said, when I was 7 years old, and I was kind of thrown in there. It was not even my decision. It was my parents' decision. Kid has a lot of energy. Somebody told them about karate, martial arts, taekwondo. Those sports are good for very energetic kids, and it was just something that I liked from the very beginning and stuck with for many years. I started competing at a very young age. I was probably 9, 10 years old. And then that was kids, children's competition. But then when I was around 14, 15, was already into the adult, competing, on a by what weight classes. I was in the very kind of lower weight classes, or the thin and the flyweight classes of the world, already competing with adults. And yes, I competed and really took it on the sport, and practiced and competed intensely in my high school years. you going to different parts of the world to compete, and achieving national championships as well as international championships, world championships. At the time, and even in the time when I was in Lewis and Clark, Taekwondo was not an Olympic sponsored sport. Now it is. But it was, a world. They had world competition, which in a way was more interesting than the Olympics in that more countries competed. So when you went to some of these competitions, you had 40, 50, 60 countries in one competition, whereas these days to make it into the Olympics, you're kind of pre-selected, and then depending on the weight class, yeah, you go and compete with less countries. So in that respect, it was perhaps more exciting.
Well, and one thing that stands out to me as I saw your nomination and as we wrote the release, which is on lcpioneers.com, spotlighting the class of 2020, is one of your biggest accomplishments. A national championship happened while you were attending Lewis and Clark. What went into competing on that stage while still enrolled at Lewis and Clark?
Yeah, well, it also has to do with how I got to Lewis and Clark, because it's an interesting story. It was really Taekwondo that kind of led my path into the school. The U.S. national one of the U.S. national coaches at the time, late '70s, early '80s, was a gentleman by the name of Tai Hong Choi, and he was a Korean that had settled in Portland and opened up a studio and started also teaching both at Portland State and at Lewis and Clark. And I met him through Taekwondo competition, and I was looking for where to go to school, and he was the one, or he had produced some top-notch competitors that were in the U.S. national team that came from Oregon, and he was the one that suggested, come check out Portland State and Lewis and Clark. And so I did, and I felt in love with Lewis and Clark in that I was looking for something small, liberal arts, and it really appealed to me. Before that, I hadn't even been to the state of Oregon. And whilst at Lewis and Clark, I was kind of, he gave some classes at Lewis and Clark and in his studio, and I was able to continue to train, not with the same intensity than when I was competing on the world stage in the high school years, because now I had to deal with my studies as well. And there was a lot of traveling involved, so I couldn't do that. But I continued to compete locally, in all of the kind of state competitions and regional competitions, California, state of Washington, Oregon, and into Vancouver, BC. Um, and yeah, while I was in that time, uh, you know, made it into the Oregon State team, which subsequently went to compete in the nationals. This was the year of 1983 that were held in DC, and I got now on a national basis first place in the U.S. During my years at Lewis and Clark.
So you're our lifetime achievement inductee, and I'm curious, not to steal thunder from a speech that we hope to hear during an in-person induction next spring, but when you got the phone call to find out that you're joining the Lewis and Clark Athletics Hall of Fame, what was your reaction?
Yeah, well, couldn't be more excited, especially because I know that, as you said at the very beginning, it's not a collegiate sponsored or NCAA sport. So to get the recognition, I think is all the more meaningful, at least to me. And it allows me to stay also connected to the school in one way, to have an excuse to visit and take my kids back to the school, which I've not been to the school I did visit a couple years ago, but it's probably been, I don't know, 10, maybe 12 years since I last visited the LC campus. So that's also exciting, and it's just a great feeling.
So then, outside of the sport and outside of your achievements, when you look back at your experience holistically at Lewis and Clark, what were some of the highlights for you?
Yeah, well, look, as I said, the part of the appeal of Lewis and Clark was liberal arts. At the time, I didn't really know what I wanted career-wise, so Lewis and Clark and the liberal arts education allowed me to explore. I loved the two things that really appealed to me and appealed through the 4 years that I was there were the people and the campus and just the environment and the way of thinking. I double majored in economics and business. I made great friendships that to this day I keep. Some of those friendships also were in the kind of in the taekwondo team, and some were not. Uh, but Lewis and Clark allowed me to really balance well that love I had for the sport, uh, but that I knew I wasn't going to do for the rest of my life, nor was there a professional future for me there. And at the end, it was my academic studies that took me in a direction into my professional life, and I was able to get a very good grounding at Lewis and Clark academically.
Pablo Arizmendi, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Congratulations on your induction for Lifetime Achievement into the Lewis and Clark Athletics Hall of Fame. And we look forward to seeing you in person, like you said, after 10 or 12 years back on campus as soon as it's possibly able to happen. So thank you so much for your time today on the show.
Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. You're watching lcpioneers.com live and a special two-guest episode. When we come back, we'll talk to Meritorious Service, class of 2020 inductee into the Hall of Fame, Judy McMullen. We'll do that next on lcpioneers.com live.
I think everyone should take intro to chemistry because the chemistry department here is phenomenal. Everyone I've known has had a good experience with everyone in that department, so I think it's a worthwhile course to take.
What is one class that everyone should take at Lewis and Clark? I really enjoyed education in a complex world. You kind of get to discuss all the issues that exist within education today, and you get to kind of explore that by going to classrooms firsthand and volunteering with children, which I thought was a really wonderful experience.
One class that everybody should take at Lewis and Clark is anything with Kundai Chirindo. I think he definitely changed how I thought about rhetoric and media studies and just education in general.
For me, it was international affairs, just intro to international affairs, because I think it really gives a good perspective on important issues around the world.
Welcome back to lcpioneers.com live, presented by PioStream. We continue our conversation over this Hall of Fame celebration, Hall of Fame week, as we've had the chance to talk to several of our inductees into the class of 2020 for the Lewis and Clark Athletics Hall of Fame. And that continues now as we have a chance to bring in a very special guest, longtime member of the Lewis and Clark Pioneers family, was an administrator, was a coach, and we bring in Judy McMullen to the show. Judy, thanks so much for taking the time. We had a good chance to talk to Pablo about his Lifetime Achievement induction, and now we get to talk to you about your Meritorious Service induction to the Athletics Hall of Fame. Before we look forward, though, let's look back. Describe why you got to Lewis and Clark in the first place. What's the origin story?
Oh, wow. It's a little long, but I'll shorten it for you. I actually was living in Steamboat Springs, Colorado at the time I applied for the job. I had formerly been at the University of Iowa as a head women's basketball coach at the University of Iowa for 4 years, and prior to that, a high school coach out in California. I'd taken some time off when I left the University of Iowa just to sort of recharge and so on, and I intended to get right back into coaching after taking a year or so off, but it turned out to be longer than that. So when the Lewis and Clark job came up, it seemed like a great match. It was both administration and coaching, which is what I was looking to do, and that's how I ended up at Lewis and Clark.
Now, you serve in that coaching capacity. What was it in about 1994, right, when you first got
Correct.
to Lewis and Clark? And
Right.
it's interesting because right now we're celebrating the 25th year of the Northwest Conference being part of the NCAA Division III era, and you were part of that transition. What was that experience like converting from one organization to another?
Well, it was interesting. And I was doing it both as a coach and as administrator. So you know, it was a time of a lot of some consternation within the conference because not necessarily all of our conference members were excited about moving to the NCAA. Our president at the time, Mike Mooney, actually was a driving force within the conference to move us to NCAA Division III. So there was a lot to learn, a lot of new stuff. I think one of the advantages I had coming in being at a Division I institution is that I did have some experience with the NCAA. So that was pretty helpful.
When you look back, as you mentioned, being a coach, being an administrator, there were a lot of roles that you held. I mean, even academic support, right? What
Right.
is it about the opportunity to have such a diverse range of experience in your roles that helped you build really neat relationships with student athletes? I imagine that was something where you got a variety of experiences with each student. What do you remember most about some of the students at Lewis and Clark?
Oh gosh, there are so many, so many. I think at one point I sat down and kind of figured out over the course of time I spent at Lewis and Clark how many student athletes I actually came in contact with. I mean, obviously didn't know all of them personally, but many of them. And it was something like over the course of my time there, over 1,500 student athletes. So there are just so many memorable moments. I was just thinking the other day, kind of looking at the current Hall of Fame and some of the names in there: Miley Barrett, Justin Bachman, Jimmy Rufner, uh, Karen Buraker. Uh, those were just some of the really outstanding student athletes we had. And obviously now with Lindsay coming in to the Hall of Fame, and obviously Tama Carlton. Those were some amazing young people, and I really figured out once I got to the Division III is that's where I belonged. Being at Division I was all about the athlete and less about the student, and so having this experience, the coaching, the administrative, the student and academic support, it was the whole ball game, and that's what I really, really enjoyed about my time at Lewis and Clark.
Well, and another thing about the Hall of Fame too is recently we had a women's rowing team get inducted in the Hall of Fame, and when I was writing your release, I love the note about being so critical in how women's crew became an intercollegiate sport at Lewis and Clark. What was that process like, and even having one of their vessels named after you? I think that's pretty neat.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I was not a rower, uh, so I didn't have the personal experience. But as I first came to Lewis and Clark, men's and women's rowing was a club sport, and I saw the dedication of these young people as club sport athletes, doing a lot of their own financing and so forth. And so it was just apparent to me that rowing needed to move to varsity status. It was helpful then too as we moved into NCAA Division III. in expanding our sports for women. Adding rowing made a lot of sense. And so from the early days, it took a lot of work and some convincing of people around campus, but we finally got that on board. And I would say probably one of the highlights of my time was going to, I think it may have been the '05 or '06 rowing NCAA rowing championship, where our women's 8 had made it in the first time, I think the only time, but it was a wonderful, wonderful acknowledgement of their hard work and what that program had come to mean to our student athletes.
Yeah, that induction was really great to hear stories from that era. And now we get to hear your story. I've been asking all of our inductees in an attempt not to steal something from the speech that we expect to hear coming up hopefully this spring. But when you got the phone call to find out that you were going in for meritorious service, what was your reaction?
Well, I got the call from Jeremy Lowe, our head athletic trainer now, and I knew Jeremy when he was a student athlete, so we go back quite a ways. And his name popped up on my phone, and I thought, what in the world am I getting a call from Jeremy about? And then, of course, he told me that I was going to be inducted for meritorious service, and I was really humbled. I think when you have the opportunity to spend your career doing something that you really love, uh, sorry, it's crazy.
I told you this is what happens when I bring up the speeches, so I'm not surprised. I love it.
Yeah, but when you're lucky enough to do what I got to do for most of my career, that always felt like enough. So this is just icing on the cake.
One thing that I do want to ask you about is that senior woman administrator role. Sharon Sexton holds that for us now.
Right.
It's a very important role in the scheme of collegiate athletics. What did it mean for you to have that title and do that work for the college?
Well, it was, as Sharon, I'm sure, will attest to, it is it is something that's very special, but it's something that I know she and I both take and took very seriously because, that role requires you to, you're always looking out for all of your student athletes, but um, there's a special load that you carry uh, in that role, and I think part of it is that you understand that people are looking at you, and some, especially young women, are looking up to you, and so it's very important that you know it's very important, very special, I think, to be in that role.
Judy McMullen, congratulations on being inducted. I don't know if you remember, but I certainly do. You were so
Yeah.
kind to me when I first got to Lewis and Clark and tried to do this thing that now is PioStream 10 years later. We couldn't have done it without you, and I certainly appreciate all the support you provided me over the course of that first year on Palatine Hill. Look forward to having you back on campus for an induction as soon as possible, and congratulations again on being in the Hall of Fame.
All right. Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate it.
Judy McMullen on lcpioneers.com live. Uh, Judy has an impact, obviously, with the roles that she had, but also it lives on with our Excellence in Lewis and Clark's Year of Sports annual awards that we hold at the end of each academic year, because the scholar athlete from a women's team is named the winner of the Judy McMullen Award. So to have an award named after you is no small feat, and you can see the impact that she had in the great values of NCAA Division III, the holistic approach to intercollegiate athletics. So great fun to talk to her. Great fun to talk to Pablo Arizmendi about taekwondo and induction into the Athletic Hall of Fame for lifetime achievement. And now we'll turn our attention tomorrow to track and field. Bob Harris will join us as our final individual inductee on lcpioneers.com live. We'll talk to Bob about his experience on Palatine Hill, and look forward to also Saturday with the PioStream Watchback. We're expecting on air lcpioneers.com/PioStream or right here on Facebook. You can see our Pios volleyball watch back as we take a look back to last fall and the win over Whitworth, the eventual Northwest Conference champion, on senior night with head coach Emily Hayes and some of the student athletes from that team. That'll be at 12 o'clock noon on Saturday. So until we see you for tomorrow's interview with Bob Harris, until we see you on Saturday for the Pio Stream Watchback, I'm Ryan Goff. Big thanks to Pablo and Judy for joining us. Big thanks to you for watching. This week has been a lot of fun. And if you're up for it, we will have a special event tonight. Final 5 of our teams, I want to say off the top of my head, joining with different members of the Lewis and Clark alumni base, different members of the community as part of our Homecoming at Home celebration. We're having a live chat on Zoom with coaches and student athletes from baseball, softball, rowing, tennis, and golf. Well, women's tennis and golf. I know that for a fact now that I think about it. That'll start at 5 o'clock, and to find out more information, go to go.lclark.edu/homecoming. go.lclark.edu/homecoming. So still more ways to get involved, even outside of this show. So until we talk to you again tomorrow, thanks for having fun. It was a blast to hear those stories, and I couldn't have been more ecstatic about getting to have both Pablo and Judy on the show today. We'll talk to you again tomorrow. Goodbye for now.
Hi, I'm Nick Lombardi. Something I've learned at Winterim this year is how to communicate a vision.
My biggest takeaway from Winterim is probably the networking. Getting to talk to everybody, connect with people for the future is one of the most valuable things, and I did Winterim last year, came back for more this year.
I think a way in which my liberal arts education has really helped me and my group formulate our ideas is that concept of critical thinking and having many different backgrounds. Me being an econ major and my 2 group mates being chemistry majors, we really get that well-rounded background, well-rounded ideas.
I think overall it's absolutely worth doing. You find yourself not only being more prepared for, say, well, this next semester, on top of being more prepared for life in general.
We invite you to join us.
It's time to explore Lewis and Clark.